You get $15, Dad. That's it. Those words came through my old flip phone like a sucker punch to the gut. My son Preston's voice had that smug satisfaction you hear from someone who thinks they're about to watch their enemy burn. He wanted me there at the will reading, front and center, just so he could see my face when my complete worthlessness got read into the legal record. What he didn't know was that his mother Brooke, even in death, had one last card to play. And I was about to become the centerpiece of it. My name is Garrett Walsh, I'm 58 years old, and for the past 6 years, the sound of my table saw has been my only companion. Here in my small workshop behind my rental house on the south side of Columbus, Ohio, I wasn't a failed construction foreman anymore. I wasn't a discarded husband. I was just a carpenter, a man who made honest things from raw lumber. You know how some folks find peace in church or fishing? For me, it was wood. Oak doesn't lie to you. Pine doesn't judge. Maple doesn't care about your past mistakes. Wood simply is, with all its knots and grain patterns and character marks. I respected that honesty. Hell, I envied it. The smell of sawdust and Danish oil had become my daily cologne, better than the stench of betrayal and disappointment that had followed me around for 22 years. I was working on a jewelry box for Mrs. Henderson down the street when that call came in. She was 83, lived alone since her husband passed, and she wanted something nice to leave her granddaughter. The dovetail joints were coming together perfect, tight and clean like they should be. It was peaceful work, the kind that lets your mind wander to better times. Like when I was building tree houses for Preston when he was 8, before he decided his old man was an embarrassment. Back then, he'd hand me nails and ask a million questions about why wood splits this way or that. Dad, how come the grain goes sideways here? Little hands pointing at the lumber, genuine curiosity in his eyes. That was before Brooke filled his head with poison about his criminal father. Before he learned to be ashamed of calloused hands and work boots. Before he discovered that having an ex-con dad didn't play well at the country club. My phone sat on the workbench next to a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest, Dad," a garage sale find that seemed about right for my situation. When it started buzzing, I almost didn't answer. These days, the only calls I got were wrong numbers or bill collectors, and I was current on both my rent and my truck payment. But the caller ID made my chest tighten. Preston Walsh. Same last name as mine, though he'd probably change that if he could figure out how to do it without looking like a complete jackass. 22 years. That's how long it had been since we'd had what you might call a real conversation. 22 years of silence built brick by brick with accusations, cold shoulders, and that special kind of contempt that only family can perfect. I figured that silence would last until one of us was in the ground. Turns out I was half right. I hit the power switch on my DeWalt saw, bought used from a pawn shop but still cut true, and the sudden quiet felt heavy. The workshop, which had been filled with the honest sound of work, now felt like a tomb. I wiped sawdust off my hands with an old shop rag, one of dozens I'd collected over the years from various job sites back when I still had a reputation worth protecting. "Hello?" I said, flipping the phone open. My voice came out rough, like sandpaper on pine. The voice that came back belonged to a world I'd been exiled from years ago, sharp, clipped, all business. The voice of someone who'd never worked with his hands a day in his life, never felt the satisfaction of building something solid and real. Garrett. Not Dad, not Pop. Just Garrett, like I was some stranger whose name he could barely be bothered to remember. Mother is gone. No emotion, no grief. He delivered the news like a weather report, flat and impersonal. Last Tuesday, heart attack. It was quick. I stood there looking out my workshop window at the small backyard I'd been meaning to clean up for months. The grass needed cutting, and Mrs. Patterson's cat had been using my flower bed as a litter box again. Normal problems. Manageable problems. Not like the bomb that had just exploded in my ear. Brooke. Gone. The words didn't want to fit together in my head. She'd always been like a force of nature, all drive and ambition and sharp elbows when she wanted something. Smart as a whip and twice as dangerous when she set her mind to a goal. To think of all that energy, all that fire, just extinguished. It didn't compute. We'd been divorced longer than we'd been married, but she'd shaped my life in ways I was still discovering. Not all of them good, mind you, but powerful just the same. You still there? Preston's impatience cut through my thoughts like a circular saw through plywood. Yeah, I'm here. When's the funeral? Over. Yesterday. You weren't invited. He said it like he was discussing the weather, casual as you please. No emotion, no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, I might have wanted to pay my respects to the woman I'd been married to for 15 years. That stung more than I expected. I'd known Brooke since she was 23, fresh out of business school with big dreams and bigger ambitions. We'd built something together, or thought we had. The fact that I couldn't even say goodbye to her felt like one last slap in the face. Look, here's why I'm calling, Preston continued, his voice taking on that tone he used when he was about to deliver bad news with a smile. Her lawyer needs you there. Reading of the will. This Friday, 10 a.m. sharp. Caldwell & Associates on High Street downtown. Don't be late. It wasn't a request. It was a royal summons from a prince to a peasant, delivered with all the warmth of a tax notice. Preston, I got no business being there. Your mother and I settled everything in that courtroom 22 years ago. Judge made it real clear I had nothing coming to me from her estate. The sound that came through the phone was uglier than a rusty blade on green lumber. A short, nasty bark of laughter stripped of any human warmth. Pure, undiluted contempt. Oh, I know you're not getting squat, old man. Don't fool yourself for 1 second. Mother couldn't stand the sight of you after what you did. But it's some legal requirement. Procedural nonsense. You have to be there in person to officially hear that you get exactly 0. A nice, notarized confirmation of just how worthless you are to this family. He paused, and I could practically hear him savoring what came next. Personally, I just want to see your face. I want to watch that quiet dignity act of yours crumble when you hear it read out loud in front of witnesses. About the only entertainment you're good for these days. The cruelty was surgical, precise. This wasn't the anger of a wounded son lashing out. This was calculated meanness from someone who'd already won and wanted to grind his boot heel into his opponent's face. You know what really got me? It wasn't the insults. I'd heard worse from strangers. It was the pleasure in his voice. My own son was looking forward to watching me suffer. That's what 22 years of lies and poison had created. You done? I asked, keeping my voice steady. In Vietnam, we learned that sometimes the best response to incoming fire is no response at all. Let the enemy waste their ammunition. Almost. Don't worry about the trip home afterward. I'll spot you $15 for the bus ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Think of it as a parting gift from the son you never deserved. The line went dead. Click. Just like that, my loving son had hung up on me. I stood there with the dial tone in my ear, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not quite rage, not yet. More like a slow burn, like coals buried under ash but still glowing red. He hadn't invited me to a will reading. He'd summoned me to a public execution, my execution, with him holding the axe and grinning while he did it. Fine. Let him have his show. I'd been through worse. Much worse. I set the phone down on the workbench and walked over to the jewelry box I'd been working on. Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter was going to love it. The wood was honest walnut, the joints were tight and true, and it would last longer than the 3 of us put together. That's what good work does. It outlasts the pain that made it. But I wasn't thinking about jewelry boxes anymore. I was thinking about the last time I'd worn my good suit, 22 years ago in that Columbus courthouse where everything I'd built got torn down in front of a judge and jury, where Brooke sat at the plaintiff's table and testified that I'd betrayed her trust, stolen from her company, and destroyed our family. All lies, every single word. But lies that served her purpose, so they became the official truth. That suit was hanging in the back of my bedroom closet, covered in dust and mothballs. Charcoal gray wool, good fabric that had cost me a week's wages back when I still drew a foreman's pay. I'd worn it to our wedding, to Preston's high school graduation, and finally to my own professional funeral. Looked like it was time to put it on one more time. I walked back into the house, past the kitchen where I ate most of my meals standing up, past the living room with the secondhand furniture and the TV that got 3 channels on a good day. My bedroom wasn't much. A double bed, a dresser from the Salvation Army, and that closet where my past hung waiting. The closet door creaked when I opened it, a sound that reminded me of every old house I'd ever lived in. There it was, hanging at the very back behind my work shirts and the 2 pairs of jeans that made up my entire wardrobe these days. The garment bag was dusty, like everything else from my former life. I pulled it out and unzipped it slowly. The charcoal gray wool still looked good, though it smelled like mothballs and memories. This suit had seen better days and better men wearing it. I held up the jacket and could still see myself at 36, standing in front of the courthouse steps with my lawyer, thinking I had a chance at justice. Back then, I still believed the truth mattered, that if I just explained things clearly enough, showed them the paperwork, laid out the timeline, people would see that I'd been trying to save the company, not destroy it. I was naive enough to think that 15 years of marriage and a lifetime of honest work would count for something. How wrong I was. See, here's what really happened in 2005, the story Preston never heard because his mother made sure he wouldn't. Reynolds Construction Group was hemorrhaging money faster than a busted water main. Brooke had gotten us into a development deal down in Delaware that was supposed to be our ticket to the big leagues. Shopping mall, mixed-use development, the whole 9 yards. Problem was, the local officials down there had their hands out every time you turned around. Permits that should have cost thousands were suddenly costing tens of thousands. Inspections that used to take days were taking months. Every time we thought we'd cleared another hurdle, somebody would find a new regulation we needed to comply with. Brooke was in over her head, but too proud to admit it. The company was burning through cash, and the Delaware project was turning into a black hole. We were 60 days away from bankruptcy, maybe less. The bank was making noises about calling in our loans. Suppliers were demanding cash on delivery. It was ugly. That's when the men in expensive suits showed up at our Columbus office. They had a solution, they said. A way to make all our problems disappear. They could make the Delaware permits go through, get the inspections fast-tracked, even help us line up new investors. All we had to do was adjust some numbers on our tax filings, make our expenses look a little higher than they were, route some payments through companies they'd set up. What they were describing was tax evasion, plain and simple. Nothing violent, nothing that hurt anybody directly, but definitely illegal. The kind of thing that could land you in federal prison if you got caught. Brooke panicked. I don't blame her for that. She'd worked her whole life to build something, and watching it all crumble would break anyone. But she couldn't make the decision. She kept going back and forth, weighing the risks, terrified of both options. So I made the decision for her. I told those suits that I'd handle their paperwork. I set up the shell companies under my contractor's license. I signed the inflated invoices. I made sure that if anyone came looking, they'd find my name on everything, not hers. I built a legal firewall around Brooke and the company, and I stood right in the middle of the fire. For 2 years it worked. The Delaware project got back on track. The cash flow stabilized. Reynolds Construction Group not only survived, it thrived. By 2007, we were pulling down contracts worth millions, and Brooke was being written up in business magazines as one of Ohio's most successful female entrepreneurs. But you can't dance with the devil forever without someone calling in the bill. The IRS audit started in late 2007. They'd been tracking those Chicago suits for months, following the money trail through shell companies and fake invoices. When they got to our books, they found exactly what I'd set them up to find. My signature on every questionable document. They offered me a deal. Give us the real players, they said. Tell us who was running the scheme, who was calling the shots, and we'll work with you. Might even avoid prison time. I could have given them Brooke. Could have explained how she'd been pressured into the deal, how I'd taken it on to protect her. The prosecutor might have gone easy on both of us if I'd told the truth. Instead, I told them it was all my idea, that I'd gotten greedy, cut corners, made some bad decisions when money got tight. I painted myself as a crooked contractor who'd gotten in over his head, nothing more. They didn't buy it completely, but they couldn't prove otherwise. My story hung together just well enough to be believable. I pled guilty to tax evasion and conspiracy to defraud the government, lost my contractor's license permanently, paid a fine that wiped out what little savings I had left. But I didn't go to prison, and more importantly, they never touched Brooke. That should have been the end of it. I'd taken the fall, paid the price, and Brooke was free and clear to run her company without a criminal husband dragging down her reputation. We could have gotten through it together, maybe even come out stronger. But that's when my loving son decided to twist the knife. Preston was 23 then, fresh out of Ohio State with his MBA and a head full of big ideas about how business should work. He'd interned at some fancy consulting firm in Chicago the summer before, and came back acting like he knew more about running a company than people who'd been doing it for decades. When news of my guilty plea hit the Columbus Business Journal, Preston saw his opportunity. He couldn't wait to get to his mother with his interpretation of events. According to him, I wasn't the family hero who'd sacrificed his career to save the company. I was the family villain who'd betrayed their trust and nearly destroyed everything they'd worked for. "He's made us all look like fools, Mother," I heard him telling Brooke one night when he thought I was asleep. "Everyone in town is talking about how the great Garrett Walsh turned out to be just another crooked contractor. How does that make you look? How does that make us look?" He had a point, and he knew it. Brooke had worked hard to build her reputation in Columbus business circles. She was the first woman to win the Chamber of Commerce Entrepreneur of the Year award. She sat on the boards of 3 different charities. Her success story was part of the community fabric. Having a convicted felon for an ex-husband wasn't exactly good for the brand. "Think about it," Preston continued, and I could hear that smooth, persuasive tone he'd learned in business school. "You could be the victim here instead of the accomplice, the hard-working businesswoman who was betrayed by her own husband. People would sympathize with you, not judge you." The kid was smart, I'll give him that. Evil, but smart. He painted me as a master manipulator who'd used Brooke's trust against her. In his version, I was the one who'd gotten greedy and cut corners while she was focused on the legitimate side of the business. He made it sound like I'd been running a criminal enterprise right under her nose, stealing from the company coffers while she worked honest 60-hour weeks. And Brooke, God help her, she listened. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she was tired of fighting. Maybe she just saw an easy way out of a complicated situation. But she chose to believe her son's version of the truth over her husband's sacrifice. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks after my sentencing hearing. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was sitting in our kitchen, used to be our kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to figure out what kind of work an ex-contractor with a criminal record might be able to find. The process server knocked on the door at 7 a.m. sharp, handed me the papers, and drove away. "Irreconcilable differences," the papers said. But the real meat was in the attached financial statements. Brooke was claiming that I'd stolen money from Reynolds Construction Group, that I'd hidden assets, that I'd used company funds for personal expenses without her knowledge. All lies. Every single word, but lies that fit the narrative Preston had built for her. The worst part was the custody arrangement. Preston was 23, so custody wasn't really an issue, but the papers made it clear that I was not welcome at family gatherings, company events, or anywhere else that might embarrass the Reynolds name. I was being erased from my own family's history. The divorce hearing was a nightmare. Brooke sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blue business suit, looking every inch the wronged professional woman. She testified that she'd trusted me completely, never questioned my handling of the company finances, never suspected that I was cutting corners or breaking laws. She said she felt betrayed, humiliated, afraid that my criminal behavior might have legal consequences for her and the company. She said she couldn't remain married to a man who'd put their family's future at risk for his own selfish gain. Preston sat in the gallery behind her, nodding along like a proud son supporting his wronged mother. He'd coached her well. She hit every note perfectly, painting herself as the innocent victim of her husband's criminal conspiracy. I sat there listening to this woman I'd loved for 15 years, the woman I'd sacrificed everything to protect, tell a courtroom full of strangers that I was a liar, a thief, and a criminal who'd destroyed their family. My lawyer advised me not to contest the divorce. "Take the deal," he said. "You're lucky she's not asking for alimony. Fight this and she might start asking uncomfortable questions about where that money really went." So I signed the papers, gave up any claim to the house, the company, the life we'd built together, walked away with my truck, my tools, and the clothes on my back. The years after the divorce were the hardest of my life, and that's saying something for a guy who spent a year dodging bullets in the Mekong Delta. At least in Vietnam, you knew who the enemy was. Back home in Columbus, the enemy was wearing my family's face. Finding work was like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Word gets around fast in the construction business, especially when it involves tax evasion and criminal charges. Didn't matter that I'd been one of the most respected foremen in Central Ohio for 20 years. Didn't matter that I'd never cut corners on safety or quality. All that mattered was that I was now Garrett Walsh, convicted felon. The first few months, I burned through what little savings I had left after the legal fees and fines. Tried to get work with some of the smaller contractors, guys who'd worked for me back when I was running jobs for Reynolds Construction. Most of them wouldn't even return my calls. The ones who did were polite but firm. Sorry, Garrett, nothing personal, but we can't take that kind of risk. I don't blame them. Business is business, and having an ex-con on your payroll raises questions with bonding companies, insurance providers, even some clients. Why take the chance when there were plenty of clean contractors looking for work? Eventually, I found day labor through a temp agency. $90 a day, cash under the table, no questions asked. Manual labor mostly, loading trucks, cleaning, job sites, demo work that required more muscle than skill. It was honest work, but it was a long way down from running million-dollar construction projects. The worst part wasn't the money, though that was tight enough to choke a horse. The worst part was the silence. For 22 years, I didn't hear a single word from my son. Not a phone call on my birthday, not a Christmas card, nothing. I'd drive past the Reynolds Construction Group offices sometimes, just to see if I could catch a glimpse of him. The company had moved to a bigger building on the north side of town, all glass and steel and modern architecture, a long way from the converted warehouse where Brooke and I had started the business with 2 employees and more dreams than capital. Preston's name was on the building directory, Preston Walsh, Vice President of Development. Vice President at 25. Not bad for a kid whose biggest accomplishment was getting his MBA without ever swinging a hammer. I heard things around town, the way you do in a place like Columbus. Preston had married well, some banker's daughter from Upper Arlington. They lived in a big colonial in Worthington, drove matching BMWs, belonged to the right country club. All the trappings of success. Meanwhile, I was living in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner on the south side, cooking meals on a hot plate and trying to figure out how to make $90 a day stretch to cover rent, food, and truck payments. But here's the thing about hitting bottom. It gives you clarity. When you've lost everything you thought mattered, you start to figure out what actually does matter. For me, it was work. Real work, with my hands, creating something useful and lasting. That's how I ended up in carpentry. Started taking on small jobs, fixing porches, building decks, custom cabinets for people who couldn't afford the big contractors. Word of mouth spread slowly, but it spread. Turned out there were plenty of folks who cared more about quality work than criminal records. Mrs. Henderson was one of my first regular customers. Her late husband had been a World War II vet, and maybe she saw something familiar in me. She'd hire me to fix things around her house, a squeaky door here, a loose board there, always paid cash, always had a pot of coffee ready when I showed up. You know, she said one day while I was replacing her back steps, my Herald used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by his mistakes, it's measured by how he handles them. Smart woman, Mrs. Henderson. Too bad her wisdom didn't run in my family. The workshop came later, after I'd saved enough money to put a down payment on the little house on Maple Street. The previous owner had used the garage for storage, but I could see the potential. Good light from the north-facing windows, concrete floor that would hold heavy equipment, plenty of space for lumber storage and finishing work. I spent 6 months converting it, working nights and weekends when I wasn't on paying jobs, built workbenches from reclaimed oak, installed dust collection systems, organized my tools on pegboard walls. It became my sanctuary, the one place where everything made sense. In that workshop, I wasn't Garrett Walsh, the convicted felon. I wasn't the discarded husband or the forgotten father. I was just a craftsman, making beautiful things from raw materials. The wood didn't judge me. The tools didn't care about my past. The work spoke for itself. 6 years of that life. 6 years of quiet mornings in the workshop, honest labor, simple pleasures. No drama, no betrayal, no family complications. Just me, my tools, and projects that had clear beginnings and satisfying endings. I should have known that peace wouldn't last forever. Nothing good ever does, at least not in my experience. But that Thursday evening before Preston's call, I was feeling pretty satisfied with life. I'd finished Mrs. Henderson's jewelry box, the joints were perfect, and the finish was smooth as glass. Had 3 more projects lined up for the next month, including a custom dining table for a young couple who'd just bought their first house. It reminded me of when Brooke and I were young, scraping together money for our first real furniture. We'd bought a kitchen table from a yard sale for $20, spent 2 weekends sanding and refinishing it together. She'd insisted on doing the final coat of polyurethane herself, said she wanted to be part of building something that would last. That table probably ended up in the divorce settlement too, along with everything else from our life together. But I wasn't dwelling on the past that night. I was planning the next day's work, checking my supply of Danish oil, making sure my chisels were sharp. Simple, honest concerns that had simple, honest solutions, the kind of problems you could actually fix with effort and attention to detail. Then Friday morning came, and with it, the decision to dig that old suit out of the closet. The drive to Columbus took about 20 minutes from my place on Maple Street. I could have taken the bus. Preston's $15 would probably have covered the fare, but I still had my pride. Some of it, anyway. My truck was a 2003 Silverado with 180,000 miles on it, more rust than paint in places, but the engine ran strong and it got me where I needed to go. Parking downtown cost me $8 for the day, which stung more than it should have. When you're living on carpenter's wages, $8 is a meal. But I found a spot 3 blocks from the Caldwell & Associates building and walked the rest of the way. Columbus has changed a lot in the past 20 years. When I was running construction jobs in the 1990s, downtown was mostly empty office buildings and vacant storefronts. Now there were breweries and coffee shops, trendy restaurants with names I couldn't pronounce, young professionals walking around in expensive clothes, talking on phones that probably cost more than I made in a month. Progress, I guess, though it didn't feel like progress for guys like me. The Caldwell & Associates building was exactly what you'd expect from a successful law firm. Not the biggest building on High Street, but substantial. Old-fashioned brick and limestone, the kind of architecture that was built to last. The kind of building that said, "We've been here for generations, and we'll be here for generations more." I stood outside for a minute, checking my watch. 9:45 a.m. Early, but not too early. I wanted to be composed when I walked in, wanted to project whatever dignity I had left. This was going to be hard enough without looking like some desperate old man begging for scraps. The lobby was all dark wood and brass fixtures designed to impress clients and intimidate opponents. My work boots echoed on the marble floor, announcing my presence to everyone in earshot. A few younger lawyers looked up from their phones, sized me up in about 2 seconds, and went back to their important business. I wasn't their demographic. Hell, I wasn't anybody's demographic anymore. The receptionist was young, blonde, professionally cheerful in that way they teach in business school. "Can I help you?" Garrett Walsh. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock reading, Brooke Walsh's will." Her expression flickered for just a moment. The name Walsh clearly meant something to her, but my appearance didn't match whatever she was expecting. "Of course, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Manning will be right with you. Please have a seat." She gestured toward a waiting area with leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I sat on the edge of one, my hands resting on my knees. The magazines on the coffee table were all business journals and legal publications, nothing I'd have any interest in reading. I was early, which gave me time to think. Always dangerous thinking, especially about family, about choices made and chances lost, about whether there might have been a different way to handle things back in 2005. But regret is like sawdust. It gets into everything if you let it, and it's hell to clean up. Better to focus on what's in front of you, deal with what you can control. What I could control was how I handled myself in the next hour. Preston wanted a show, wanted to watch me crumble when I heard how worthless his mother considered me. Fine, let him look. He'd see a man who'd lost everything he thought mattered and somehow managed to keep going anyway. Maybe that would teach him something. Probably not. But a father can hope. At exactly 10 a.m., a heavy oak door opened, and a man in his 60s stepped into the lobby. Tall, distinguished, wearing a gray suit that spoke of quiet authority rather than flashy wealth. This had to be Caleb Manning. He had the kind of face you'd trust with your life savings. Honest, weathered, impossible to read. The kind of man who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by much of anything anymore. His eyes swept the lobby, passed over the young lawyers and their expensive phones, and landed on me. He held my gaze for a moment, and I caught something in his expression. Not pity exactly, but understanding. Like he knew more about my situation than he was letting on. "Mr. Walsh," he said, walking toward me. His voice was respectful, formal, but not cold. "Thank you for coming." Simple words, but they hit me harder than I expected. It had been a long time since anyone had thanked me for anything. Longer still since anyone had spoken to me with genuine respect. That's when they made their entrance. Preston didn't just walk into that lobby, he owned it. Strode through those glass doors like he was arriving at his own coronation, and he wasn't alone. The entourage he'd brought along told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to play out. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Everything about him screamed success. The perfect haircut, the gleaming watch, the confident swagger of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Behind him came a thin, blonde woman in designer clothes, clutching an expensive purse and scrolling through her phone. That had to be Paige, though she looked more like arm candy than wife material. The third member of their little parade was a guy in his 40s with teeth too white to be natural and a tan that screamed Florida vacation home. Drew Fisher, Preston's business partner and fellow parasite. Preston walked straight to the reception desk without so much as glancing in my direction. "Preston Walsh," he announced, his voice carrying across the marble lobby. "Manning's expecting me." The receptionist practically glowed. "Yes, Mr. Walsh." "Right away, sir. Please, make yourselves comfortable." Then he turned and saw me sitting there. The look that crossed his face was pure predatory satisfaction, like a cat that's just cornered a mouse. He walked over, his expensive shoes silent on the marble, his 2 companions trailing behind like pilot fish following a shark. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the woodwork." His voice was loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "You actually showed up. I wasn't sure you'd have the nerve." He looked me up and down, taking in my pressed but outdated suit, my work-worn hands, my general air of being a man who belonged somewhere else. Anywhere else. "Paige," he said to the blonde, who looked up from her phone with the expression of someone forced to notice something distasteful. "Drew, I'd like you to meet my father, the one I told you about." The word father came out like an apology, like he was embarrassed to share genetic material with someone so obviously beneath his current social station. Drew extended his hand with a smile that belonged on a used car lot. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Walsh. Preston's told us so much about you." I shook his hand briefly. His grip was soft, manicured. Never done real work a day in his life, I'm sure he has. Paige barely acknowledged my existence, giving me the kind of quick, dismissive glance you'd give a piece of furniture you were thinking about throwing away. "I have to say," Preston continued, his voice getting louder, "I wasn't sure you'd be able to afford the bus fare, but here you are, dressed up in your—" He paused, looking at my suit with exaggerated consideration. Vintage formal wear, very retro, very authentic working-class chic. The cruelty was casual, practiced. This wasn't the anger of a hurt son. This was the methodical meanness of someone who'd been planning this moment for years. Drew chuckled appreciatively. Paige smirked without looking up from her phone. I didn't say anything. Just sat there, meeting Preston's gaze steadily. My silence seemed to annoy him more than any angry response would have. He was performing for his audience, and I wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted. "The strong, silent type," he said, turning to his companions. "That's Dad's specialty. Sit there quietly while the adults handle the important business." Though I suppose that strategy worked out pretty well for him in court, didn't it? Kept his mouth shut, took his medicine like a good little criminal. The words stung, but I'd heard worse. What got to me was the pleasure in his voice. My own son was enjoying this. He'd summoned me here not just to witness my humiliation, but to participate in it. Before I could respond, Manning's voice cut through the performance. "Mr. Walsh." His tone was different now, cooler, more formal. He was looking at Preston, and there was something in his expression that made my son's smile falter slightly. "We're ready to begin." The conference room was designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table dominated the space, so polished you could see your reflection in it. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one wall, but they didn't offer much of a view, just the gray facades of other downtown buildings pressing close. It was a room built for serious business, the kind of place where fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen. Preston naturally claimed the seat at the far end of the table, the spot that clearly marked him as the guest of honor. He settled in like a king taking his throne, spreading his arms wide across the back of his chair. Paige sat to his right, still glued to her phone. Drew took the left flank, that predatory smile never leaving his face. I chose a seat near the door, close to an exit, just there to fulfill a legal requirement, nothing more. Manning walked to the head of the table carrying a thick leather portfolio. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he placed the folder on the polished surface with a soft but definitive thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Then he pulled out his chair with deliberate slowness, sat down, and reached into his breast pocket for a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. Everything about his movements was methodical, unhurried. He was establishing control, setting the pace. This was his domain, his rules. He opened the portfolio and removed a thick document bound in cream-colored paper. Official seals and ribbons marked it as something important, something final. "This," he began, his voice filling the room with quiet authority, "is the last will and testament of Brooke Reynolds Walsh, dated September 15th of this year." Even in death, she was making a statement. Brooke Reynolds Walsh. She'd kept both names, the one she was born with and the one she'd taken when we married. The Reynolds name had built the empire, but the Walsh name had saved it, though only one of us ever got credit for that. I, Brooke Reynolds Walsh, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all former wills and codicils heretofore made by me. Preston checked his expensive watch, already looking bored. This was just a formality before the real celebration could begin. He knew how this story ended, with him inheriting everything and me getting officially recognized as worth exactly nothing. "First," Manning continued, "I direct that all my just debts and funeral expenses be paid from my estate." Standard language. Preston yawned. "Second, I give and bequeath the sum of $25,000 to my housekeeper, Shelby Cooper, in gratitude for her 15 years of faithful service and for never once judging the choices I made, even when she had every right to." Preston's eyes rolled so hard I'm surprised they didn't fall out of his head. "Seriously?" he muttered to Drew. 25 grand for the help? But I found myself almost smiling. Shelby had been with Brooke since the lean years, back when Reynolds Construction was still operating out of that converted warehouse. She'd seen everything, the good times and the bad, the fights and the reconciliations, the slow destruction of our marriage. If anyone deserved a piece of Brooke's fortune, it was her. Third, Manning read on, I give and bequeath the sum of $15,000 to the Franklin County Veterans Memorial Fund, in honor of all those who served their country with distinction, especially those whose sacrifices went unrecognized. This time, the almost smile became real. After all these years, all the bitterness and silence she'd remembered. I was a Vietnam vet, came home in '75 with shrapnel scars and nightmares that took years to fade. Before everything went wrong, before Preston decided I was an embarrassment, Brooke used to say she was proud of my service. Apparently, some part of her still was. Fourth, I give and bequeath the sum of $10,000 to my driver, Lance Harper, for his excellent service and his discretion regarding the many difficult conversations he overheard during our drives together. Preston was getting visibly agitated. His fingers started drumming on the polished table, a sharp staccato that echoed in the quiet room. Manning, for God's sake, how many of these charity donations are there? Can we move this along? Manning looked up from the document, his eyes finding Preston's over the rim of his reading glasses. The look was cold, professional, and utterly unimpressed. Mr. Walsh, he said, and there was steel in his voice now, your mother was very specific about how this will should be read. Every word, in order, without interruption. I suggest you compose yourself and allow me to continue. The rebuke was quiet but devastating. Preston's face flushed red, but he didn't say anything else. Drew shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even Paige looked up from her phone, sensing the tension in the room. Manning adjusted his glasses and returned to the document. Fifth, regarding the personal effects and business associates of my son. Drew straightened up, his shark-like smile returning. This was where the side players got their rewards for loyalty to the heir apparent. To my son's business partner, Mr. Drew Fisher, Manning read, and I caught the slight emphasis he put on the word partner, like he was placing it in quotation marks. Drew's shark smile widened. He adjusted his tie, preening like a peacock. This was his moment. I give and bequeath the sum of $2,000. The smile froze on Drew's face. $2,000. It wasn't just small, it was insulting. A slap in the face dressed up as a gift. But Manning wasn't finished. I bequeath this sum, he continued, with the strong recommendation that Mr. Fisher invest it in a course on business ethics, as my review of his financial practices suggests he has significant room for improvement in this area. The conference room went dead silent. Drew's face cycled through several colors. White, red, then a sickly green. He'd just been called a crook in front of everyone, his reputation torched in a single sentence. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, his composure completely shattered. What kind of sick joke? "And to my son's companion, Miss Paige Winters," Manning continued, ignoring Drew's outburst completely. Paige looked up from her phone for the first time since we'd sat down, her eyes bright with expectation. She'd probably been counting on a nice little nest egg, something to secure her position in Preston's life. I leave the costume jewelry collection from my bedroom dresser. Specifically, the pieces she admired so much during her last visit to my home. Paige's perfectly made-up face went blank with confusion. Costume jewelry? What's that supposed to mean? Manning's voice remained perfectly neutral. The imitation pieces that were substituted for several valuable items that went missing after your December visit. I'm sure you'll find them familiar. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Paige hadn't just been given worthless trinkets. She'd been exposed as a thief. In front of Preston, in front of Drew, in front of me. Her face turned the color of fresh paint. "That crazy old bitch!" she shrieked, her carefully cultivated sophistication evaporating instantly. "She's lying! I never took anything! I never even—" "Shut up!" Preston roared, his voice bouncing off the mahogany walls. He wasn't defending her. He was trying to control the damage to his own image. The woman he'd brought as his trophy had just been revealed as a common criminal. I sat there watching the show, and for the first time in 22 years, I felt a connection to Brooke. This was the woman I'd married. Brilliant, calculating, surgical in her precision. She wasn't just reading a will, she was settling scores, dismantling Preston's entire support system piece by piece. Manning waited for the shouting to die down, then turned to a fresh page. Article 7. To my son, Preston Walsh. Preston leaned forward, his face flushed but his eyes hungry. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for his entire adult life. Everything else had been appetizers. This was the main course. I give and bequeath the lakefront cottage on Buckeye Lake, along with its contents and furnishings. Preston exhaled hard, relief flooding his features. The lake house was worth at least $1 million, maybe more. Brooke had bought it as a weekend retreat back in the 90s, turned it into a showcase of expensive taste. Thank God, he muttered. Finally, we're getting somewhere. But Manning held up a single finger, and Preston's celebration died before it could really begin. However, Manning said, and the word hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, this bequest comes with certain conditions. Conditions? Preston's voice cracked slightly. What kind of conditions? The property may only be inherited by an heir who has demonstrated, Manning read carefully, and I quote, the values of hard work, integrity, and family loyalty that built the Walsh family legacy. The color started draining from Preston's face. He knew where this was going, and he didn't like the destination. Furthermore, Manning continued relentlessly. This inheritance requires the written recommendation of 3 character witnesses who have known the recipient for at least 10 years and can attest to his moral character and work ethic. Preston was staring now, his mouth slightly open, his breathing shallow. In the event that such character witnesses cannot be obtained within 60 days of this reading, Manning finished, the lakefront property shall be donated to the Franklin County Veterans Memorial Fund. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on that polished conference table. Preston looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Character witnesses? He whispered. What the hell is she talking about? I'm her son. But Manning was already turning the page, and I could see there was more to come. Much more. We now proceed, he said, his voice dropping into an even more serious register, to Article 8. the disposition of the primary estate. This was it. The big reveal. The moment that would determine who got the $12.5 million empire that Brooke had built. Preston was breathing hard now, his face pale as old concrete. His entire world was balanced on the edge of Manning's next words, and he knew it. The cocky confidence he'd worn into the room was gone, replaced by naked fear. "Before I proceed with the disposition of the primary estate," Manning said, his voice taking on a grave formality, "your mother has left specific instructions that I read aloud a letter she wrote to explain her final decisions." He reached into the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. Brooke's personal letterhead, the kind she'd used for important correspondence. "This letter," Manning continued, "is addressed to you, Preston, but with explicit instructions that it be read in the presence of all parties named in this will." Preston made a small sound, like air being let out of a tire. He knew what was coming, maybe not the details, but he could sense the shape of it. Manning adjusted his glasses and began to read, and suddenly it wasn't his voice anymore. It was Brooke's words, Brooke's thoughts, reaching out from beyond the grave to set the record straight. "My dear son Preston," he read, "I am writing this because I am finally done with being a coward. For 22 years I have allowed you to believe a lie that I created, nurtured, and used to destroy a good man. Your father." "No," Preston whispered. It was barely audible, but in that silent room it sounded like a gunshot. Manning's voice was relentless, carrying Brooke's confession forward like an avalanche. "The story you grew up believing, that your father was a criminal who betrayed our family and stole from our company, is completely false, the exact opposite of the truth." Preston lurched halfway across the table, his eyes wild. "She was sick, senile. This isn't real. This is some kind of fraud." But Manning had anticipated this. He calmly lifted another document from his portfolio. "Attached to your mother's letter is a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted by 3 independent doctors just 2 weeks before she signed this will. Their unanimous conclusion: your mother was mentally sharp, legally competent, and in full command of her faculties." He dropped the report on the table with a heavy thud. "She was not, Mr. Walsh, confused. She was, as she states here, finally ready to tell the truth." Manning returned to the letter, his voice carrying Brooke's long-suppressed confession. "The truth, Preston, is this. In 2005, Reynolds Construction Group was facing complete financial collapse. I had made terrible decisions, trusted the wrong people, and we were 60 days from bankruptcy and criminal charges for tax evasion. I closed my eyes, remembering those dark nights when Brooke couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't see any way out of the hole she'd dug. We were offered one escape route," Manning continued reading. "A deal with investors from Chicago who would inject the money we needed to survive. But the deal required us to inflate invoices and manipulate tax filings, essentially to launder money through our construction projects." Preston was shaking his head frantically, but the words kept coming. "I was paralyzed by fear. I was ready to let everything collapse rather than break the law. But your father made a different choice. He took the deal and he structured it so that if anyone came looking, they would find his name on every document, not mine." The room was dead silent except for Manning's steady voice reading Brooke's confession. "When the IRS investigation came, they came for Garrett because that's exactly what he had planned. He confessed to crimes he didn't commit to protect me and to protect you. He lost his career, his reputation, his entire future to save ours." Manning paused, looked directly at Preston, then continued. "And how did I repay this sacrifice? I listened to your poison. I let you convince me that he was the villain instead of the hero. I divorced him, abandoned him, and let you treat him like garbage for 22 years. Preston made a broken sound, like something fundamental inside him had snapped. "This company you're so eager to inherit," Manning read, "this $12.5 million empire you think belongs to you by right, it exists for one reason only, because Garrett Walsh sacrificed everything to save it." Manning set down the letter and picked up the final page of the will. "Therefore, having told the truth that should have been told 22 years ago, I hereby bequeath all remaining assets of my estate, including my controlling interest in Reynolds Construction Group, all real estate holdings, investments, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $12.5 million, to my ex-husband, Garrett Walsh. The words didn't register at first. They just hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. $12.5 million. The company. Everything. Preston made a sound that wasn't quite human. No, he breathed. No, she wouldn't. She couldn't. But Manning wasn't finished. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single cashier's check. He slid it across the polished table until it stopped in front of my son. And for Preston Walsh, Manning said, his voice flat and final, who offered his father $15 for bus fare home, I leave him exactly what he promised. $15. The check sat there like a tombstone. Preston stared at it, and I watched 36 years of entitlement crumble in real time. Then he exploded. No. The sound that came out of Preston wasn't a word. It was pure rage, a primal scream that seemed to come from his soul. He swept his arm across the table, sending glasses, papers, and Manning's water carafe flying. Crystal shattered against the mahogany walls with a sound like breaking bones. "I'll sue!" he shrieked, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I'll fight this. She was crazy, senile. This is fraud." He spun around, his movements wild and uncoordinated, his perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from his thrashing. "Preston," Drew started, but my son wasn't listening to anyone anymore. "This was you." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You manipulated her. You poisoned her mind against me. You worthless criminal piece of—" That's when he lunged. He didn't just walk around the table. He launched himself like a man possessed, coming straight for my throat. But Manning was ready. His hand hit the intercom button, and before Preston could get halfway around that massive conference table, the door burst open. 2 security guards filled the doorway, big men in dark suits who moved like they'd done this before. They had Preston's arms pinned behind his back before he could blink, professional and efficient. "Get your hands off me!" Preston screamed, thrashing against their grip like a wild animal. "I'm Preston Walsh. I own this building. I'll have your jobs." But his threats sounded hollow now, pathetic. He wasn't Preston Walsh, heir to millions anymore. He was just a broken man having a public meltdown. Manning stood up slowly, surveying the wreckage of his conference room with the calm of a man who'd seen it all before. "Remove him from the building," he said quietly, "and make sure he doesn't return." "You can't do this to me!" Preston shrieked as they dragged him toward the door, his expensive shoes scuffing on the marble. "I'll destroy you. All of you." But his voice was already fading as they pulled him down the hall. Drew and Paige didn't wait to be escorted out. They gathered their things and slipped away like rats abandoning a sinking ship, probably already planning how to distance themselves from the disaster that Preston had become. And then there were 2. Manning and I sat in the devastated conference room, surrounded by broken glass and scattered papers. The silence felt heavy, profound. After 22 years of lies, the truth had finally been told. After decades of exile, I'd been vindicated. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something that should never have begun. "Mr. Walsh," Manning said finally, his voice gentle, "are you all right?" I looked down at my hands, rough, calloused carpenter's hands that now owned a $12.5 million empire. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I never wanted this. The money, the company, I just wanted my name back." Manning nodded. "Your ex-wife understood that. She knew the money wouldn't undo the damage, but she hoped it might give you some measure of peace." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out one final envelope. "She asked me to give you this, a personal letter, separate from the will." I took it with shaking hands. My name was written on it in Brooke's familiar script, the same handwriting that used to leave me love notes in my lunchbox back when we were happy. "Take your time," Manning said, standing. "I'll be in my office when you're ready to discuss the practical matters." Alone in the conference room, I opened Brooke's final letter to me. "Garrett, by the time you read this, you'll know everything. The truth about 2005, about what you sacrificed, about the lies I let our son believe. I have no excuse for any of it except cowardice. You were the best man I ever knew, and I destroyed you to save my own pride. I let Preston grow up hating the father who saved us both. That's a sin I'll carry to my grave. I know you don't want the money. I know you've built a good life without it. But you earned every penny of this fortune twice over, once by saving it, and again by paying the price I should have paid. Do with it what you think is right. Give it away, keep it. Use it to help other veterans who've been forgotten like you were. It's yours by right. I loved you, Garrett, even when I was betraying you, even when I was choosing the easy lie over the hard truth. I never stopped loving you. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have left to give you. Forever regretful, Brooke. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. The anger I'd carried for 22 years was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding maybe. Acceptance. Brooke had been weak when she needed to be strong, but in the end, she'd found the courage to tell the truth. That had to count for something. I walked to the conference room windows and looked out at the Columbus skyline. Somewhere out there, Preston was probably calling lawyers, planning his next move, refusing to accept that his world had changed forever. Some people never learn that the truth always wins in the end, no matter how long it takes. But I'd learned something too. I'd spent 22 years thinking I'd lost everything that mattered. Turns out what really mattered, my integrity, my capacity for sacrifice, my ability to do the right thing when it counted, none of that had ever been taken from me. The money was just money. The vindication was nice, but it was really just confirmation of what I'd always known in my heart. I'd done the right thing for the right reasons. Now I had to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Maybe I'd keep the workshop, keep making furniture for people like Mrs. Henderson, who appreciated honest craftsmanship. Maybe I'd use some of Brooke's money to help other veterans who'd been forgotten by the system. Maybe I'd just enjoy the simple pleasure of working with my hands without worrying about paying the rent. Whatever I decided, I'd do it as Garrett Walsh, not the criminal, not the scapegoat, but the man who'd sacrificed everything to save his family and somehow found his way back to himself. That felt like victory enough.